One of the most common assumptions in modern Christianity is that the gospel was intended for every human being who has ever lived. For many believers, this conclusion is so deeply ingrained that it is rarely questioned. When they encounter passages referring to the nations, the Gentiles, or the world, they instinctively understand those terms to mean all humanity without exception. At the opposite end of the spectrum are certain forms of Israel-only theology that argue the gospel was intended exclusively for biological descendants of Abraham or Jacob. According to this view, unless there was some way to trace their ancestry back to Israel, they stood entirely outside God's covenant promises. While these two positions appear to be opposites, they share one important assumption. Both define the recipients of the gospel primarily by ethnicity. One expands the covenant to everyone, while the other restricts it to genetics. But what if the biblical evidence points in a different direction than mere tribal affiliation as identity? What if the scriptures themselves present a covenant community that was broader than biological Israel, yet still more specific than humanity as a whole? To answer that question, we must begin where the covenant story begins. Too often discussions about the scope of the gospel start in the New Testament, particularly in Acts or Paul's letters. But the New Testament did not invent Israel's covenant community, it inherited it. If we want to understand who stood within that covenant community during the ministry of Jesus and the apostles, we must first understand how the Old Testament itself defined it. There is no question that God's covenant was made with Israel. The promises belonged to Israel. The law was given to Israel. The priesthood, the sacrifices, the temple, and the inheritance all belonged to Israel. Yet from the very beginning, the covenant also provided lawful means by which foreigners could become participants within Israel's covenant life. This is a point that is often overlooked, but it appears repeatedly throughout the Torah. One of the clearest examples occurs in Exodus chapter 12. Just after the mixed multitude crossed the Red Sea, God instituted the Passover. Having explained how Israel was to observe this defining covenant meal, God turns his attention to the foreigner living among them. He declares, "If a stranger sojourns with you and would keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Then he may come near and keep it. He shall be as one born in the land. One law shall be for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you." These words are remarkable. The foreigner does not suddenly become a biological descendant of Abraham. His ancestry remains exactly what it was before. What changes is his covenant status. Through circumcision and covenant participation, he becomes, in God's own words, as one born in the land. The distinction between genealogy and covenant membership could hardly be clearer. This same principle appears again in Numbers 15, where God declares, "As for the assembly, there shall be one statute for you, and for the stranger who sojourns with you. And one rule shall be for you, and for the stranger who sojourns with you." Once again, the foreigner remains ethnically distinct, yet covenantally, he stands alongside the native Israelite under the same covenant obligations. Leviticus reinforces the point by commanding Israel, "The stranger who sojourns with you shall be to you as the native among you." The Torah never confuses ancestry with covenant membership. Rather, it consistently distinguishes the two. One concerns physical descent, the other concerns participation in the covenant God established with Israel. The pattern continues in Deuteronomy. As Moses renews the covenant before Israel enters the Promised Land, he gathers not only Israel's tribal leaders, elders, men, women, and children, but also the sojourner who is in your camp. The foreigners living among Israel stand alongside native-born Israelites as participants in the covenant renewal ceremony. They are not outsiders observing from a distance. They are members of the covenant assembly itself. The prophets continue this same pattern. Isaiah 56 contains one of the most significant passages concerning foreigners in the entire Old Testament. There, the prophet addresses the foreigner who has joined himself to the Lord. Significantly, the foreigner fears being excluded, saying, "The Lord will surely separate me from his people." God's response is exactly the opposite. The Lord promises to bring these faithful foreigners to his holy mountain, to make them joyful in his house of prayer, and declares that his house will be a house of prayer for all peoples. The point is not that all nations indiscriminately become Israel. Rather, faithful foreigners who join themselves to Israel's God are welcomed within his covenant purposes. Ezekiel presents a similar picture. In his vision of Israel's restored inheritance, the prophet declares that foreigners who reside among Israel and raise children there are to receive an inheritance among the tribes. Once again, the foreigners remain foreigners ethnically, yet covenantally they share in Israel's inheritance. These passages demonstrate that God's covenant community always included more than biological descendants of Abraham. The covenant remained Israel's, but those whom God accepted into that covenant community shared in its blessings. Israel's own history illustrates this principle repeatedly. Rahab was a Canaanite from Jericho, yet she joined Israel and became part of the covenant community. Ruth was a Moabitess, yet through her faithfulness she entered Israel and eventually became the great-grandmother of King David. Caleb, one of Israel's greatest heroes, is associated with the Kenizzites. Uriah, one of David's mighty men, was a Hittite. The biblical narrative consistently distinguishes between ancestry and defining identity by covenant participation. God's people always included faithful individuals whose origins lay outside the physical descendants of Jacob. Recognizing this distinction fundamentally changes how we approach the New Testament. Some readers unconsciously assume that Israel's covenant community consisted exclusively of biological Israelites. Consequently, when they encounter Gentiles in the Gospels or Acts, they instinctively conclude that these individuals must have stood entirely outside Israel's covenant world and were secret Israelites. Yet the Old Testament itself has already shown that such an assumption is too simplistic. Long before Jesus was born, God's covenant community already included faithful foreigners who had attached themselves to Israel's God through the covenantal provisions he himself had established. This historical reality became even more visible during the Second Temple period. As Jewish communities spread throughout the Mediterranean world, synagogues became centers of worship, instruction, and community life. These synagogues were attended not only by Jews, but also by Gentiles who had abandoned paganism and attached themselves to the worship of Israel's God. Some completed full conversion through circumcision and became known as proselytes. Others remained uncircumcised while nevertheless praying to the God of Israel, supporting the Jewish community, learning Israel's scriptures, and participating regularly in synagogue life. By the 1st century, these people had become a familiar part of the religious landscape. Understanding who these people were is essential because they appear repeatedly throughout the ministry of Jesus and the mission of the apostles. They form the historical backdrop against which many of the New Testament's most debated passages unfold. Without recognizing their place within Israel's covenant world, it becomes easy to mistake the restoration of Israel's covenant community for the creation of a universal religion directed indiscriminately toward all humanity. It is to that Second Temple setting and to the communities that filled the synagogues across the Mediterranean that we now turn. By the 1st century, the covenant community, established in the Old Testament, had become even more visible throughout the Mediterranean world. Following the Babylonian exile, and especially during the Hellenistic and Roman periods, Jewish communities spread far beyond Judea. They settled throughout Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, Greece, and eventually Rome itself. Wherever these communities formed, they established synagogues. These were not merely places of worship. They served as centers of education, community life, legal instruction, and the public reading of Israel's scriptures. They became the primary gathering places for Jews living throughout the diaspora. What is often overlooked, however, is that these synagogues did not consist exclusively of ethnic Jews. They also attracted significant numbers of Gentiles who had become dissatisfied with pagan religion and had attached themselves in varying degrees to the worship of Israel's God. Ancient Jewish and Christian sources consistently recognize this phenomenon. Some of these Gentiles completed full conversion through circumcision and became known as proselytes. Others remained uncircumcised but nevertheless abandoned idolatry, attended synagogue, prayed to the God of Israel, supported the Jewish people, and learned Israel's scriptures. These individuals became commonly known as God-fearers. While their covenant status differed from that of full proselytes, both groups were already participants in Israel's religious world long before the apostles began preaching. This historical setting is essential because it forms the backdrop for nearly every missionary journey recorded in the book of Acts. Modern readers often imagine Paul traveling from city to city preaching indiscriminately to pagan populations. Luke presents a very different picture. Again and again, Paul's first destination is the synagogue. That pattern is so consistent that it becomes one of the defining characteristics of his ministry. In Pisidian Antioch, Paul enters the synagogue on the Sabbath. After the reading of the law and the prophets, he is invited to speak. Luke records Paul's opening words, "Men of Israel, and you who fear God, listen." Notice the audience. Paul distinguishes between two groups. On the one hand are the men of Israel. On the other are those who fear God. These God-fearers are not random pagans wandering into the synagogue for the first time. They are already present because they already participate in Israel's worship. They already know Israel's scriptures. They already worship Israel's God. Later, in the same chapter, Paul addresses them again, saying, "Brothers, sons of the family of Abraham, and those among you who fear God, to us has been sent the message of this salvation." Once again, Luke carefully distinguishes Jews from God-fearing Gentiles, while placing both groups within the audience receiving Paul's message. The distinction is significant. Paul's audience is broader than ethnic Israel alone, yet it is still centered upon Israel's covenant community. Luke continues this pattern throughout Acts. After Paul's sermon in Antioch, many Jews and devout proselytes follow Paul and Barnabas. Here, Luke explicitly identifies full converts to Judaism. These are not biological Israelites. They are Gentiles who entered Israel's covenant community through conversion. Their presence demonstrates once again that Israel's religious world already included people whose ancestry lay outside the 12 tribes. The same pattern appears in Thessalonica. Luke writes that some of the Jews were persuaded, as were a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. The phrase devout Greeks is particularly important. Luke is not describing ordinary pagan Greeks. The adjective translated devout literally refers to those who worship or revere God. These are Greeks already associated with synagogue life and already worshipping the God of Israel. Modern scholarship widely recognizes these devout Greeks as belonging to the same general category as the God-fearers encountered elsewhere in Acts. Paul's ministry in Berea follows exactly the same pattern. He enters the synagogue. The Berean Jews examine the scriptures daily. Luke again emphasizes a mixed audience composed of Jews and Greeks already gathered around Israel's scriptures. Even in Corinth, Paul reasons in the synagogue every Sabbath, persuading Jews and Greeks. Although Luke does not explicitly identify these Greeks as God-fearers in every instance, The synagogue setting itself strongly suggests that these are Greeks already participating in Jewish religious life rather than random idol worshippers passing through the marketplace. This repeated pattern raises an important question. If Paul's primary mission was to evangelize pagan humanity indiscriminately, why does Luke spend so much time emphasizing synagogue ministry? Why does Paul consistently begin among communities already gathered around Israel's scriptures? Why does Luke repeatedly mention Jews, proselytes, God-fearers, and devout Greeks, if those distinctions are ultimately irrelevant to the scope of the gospel? The answer seems straightforward. Paul's mission was directed toward Israel's covenant world. That world included more than biological Israelites, but it remained centered upon Israel's God, Israel's scriptures, and Israel's covenant promises. The synagogues provided precisely the communities in which those people could be found. This observation also sheds light on one of the most misunderstood passages in Acts, the conversion of Cornelius. Cornelius is frequently presented as the first Gentile convert, as though he represents pagan humanity entering God's covenant for the first time. Luke's own description tells a different story. Before Peter ever meets him, Cornelius is already introduced as a devout man who feared God with all his household. He gives alms generously to the Jewish people. He prays continually to the God of Israel. His servants later describe him as a righteous and God-fearing man, well spoken of by the whole nation of the Jews. None of these descriptions fit the stereotype of a pagan idolater. Luke deliberately portrays Cornelius as someone already attached to Israel's God, Israel's people, and Israel's religious world. This point deserves careful reflection because it fundamentally changes how Acts 10 is read. If Luke had wanted to portray the first conversion of pagan humanity, he could easily have chosen an ordinary idol worshipper from Caesarea. Instead, he selects perhaps the least pagan Gentile imaginable, a God-fearer already praying to Israel's God before Peter ever arrives. That narrative choice should not be ignored. It suggests that Luke intends his readers to see Cornelius not as a representative of generic paganism, but as a representative of covenantally attached Gentiles. Peter's vision reinforces this interpretation. The sheet descending from heaven contains animals that Peter considers unclean, but Peter himself later explains the vision's meaning. God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean. Significantly, Peter does not conclude that all humanity has now entered the covenant. Nor does he declare that the distinction between Israel and the nations has disappeared. Rather, he learns that God has accepted people whom Peter himself had previously regarded as unsuitable for fellowship. The lesson concerns Gentile God-fearers, people already standing within Israel's covenant orbit, whom the more Torah-observant Jews were discriminating against. This understanding explains Peter's astonishment far better than the common interpretation. Peter already knew that Gentiles existed. He already knew that foreigners could worship Israel's God. The Hebrew scriptures had spoken about covenantal foreigners for centuries, and synagogues throughout the diaspora already included God-fearers and proselytes. Peter's surprise, therefore, was not that Gentiles could know Israel's God. His surprise was that God publicly demonstrated his acceptance of these covenantally attached Gentiles by pouring out the Holy Spirit upon them, apart from full conversion to Judaism. The same issue resurfaces only a few chapters later at the Jerusalem Council. The controversy is often described as the church deciding whether Gentiles could become Christians. That is not actually the question Luke records. The real issue was whether Gentiles who had already believed in Israel's Messiah and had already received the Holy Spirit must also undergo circumcision and become full proselytes before enjoying complete fellowship with Jewish believers. Peter's answer is no. God had already borne witness to them by giving them the Spirit. James then interprets the entire discussion through the lens of Amos's prophecy concerning the restoration of David's fallen tent. He does not cite a prophecy about God abandoning Israel's covenant in favor of a universal religion. Instead, he interprets the acceptance of these Gentiles as part of Israel's promised restoration. His concluding observation is especially revealing. For Moses has in every city those who proclaim him, for he is read every Sabbath in the synagogues. That statement makes perfect sense. If the Gentiles under discussion were already participating in synagogue life and hearing Moses read each week, it is far more difficult to explain if the discussion concerns pagans entirely disconnected from Israel's covenant world. By the time Luke concludes this portion of Acts, a consistent picture has emerged. The apostles continually proclaim Israel's Messiah among people already connected in varying degrees to Israel's God, Israel's scriptures, and Israel's covenant expectations. Jews, proselytes, God-fearers, devout Greeks, Samaritans, and others attached to synagogue life form the primary audience of the apostolic mission. This pattern does not deny that pagans occasionally encountered the apostles. Acts certainly records such encounters, but Luke's dominant emphasis remains remarkably consistent. The gospel moves through Israel's covenant world, gathering together those whom God had long prepared through the scriptures, the synagogues, and the hope of Israel's coming Messiah. In the final part of this presentation, we will consider why this covenantal framework helps explain some of the New Testament's most debated passages, and why it offers a coherent reading of the biblical story from the ministry of Jesus through the mission of the apostles. If the covenant community of the first century consisted not only of biological Israelites, but also of proselytes, God-fearers, Samaritans, and other Gentiles who had attached themselves to Israel's God, then many of the New Testament's most debated passages begin to look quite different. Rather than presenting the sudden creation of a universal religion directed indiscriminately toward all humanity, they consistently portray the fulfillment of God's promises within Israel's covenant world. This perspective does not require us to deny the presence of Gentiles. Rather, it asks us to identify which Gentiles the biblical authors are actually discussing and how those Gentiles relate to Israel's covenant story. Remember, even after Paul was commissioned to go to the Gentiles, he again returned to visiting synagogues. What kind of Gentiles were in synagogues? God-fearers, Gentiles who were already part of Israel's synagogue community. The simplest interpretation is that Paul wasn't seeking all Gentiles everywhere. He was seeking God-fearers, Gentiles who are already attached to Israel's God, Israel's worship, and regularly heard Moses preached in the synagogue. Now, consider the Samaritan woman in John 4. This passage is frequently presented as evidence that Jesus had already expanded his mission beyond Israel. Yet the conversation itself unfolds entirely within Israel's covenantal framework. John intentionally tells us that Jesus came to Jacob's well. The woman immediately speaks of our father Jacob. She refers to our fathers worshipping on Mount Gerizim. Their discussion centers on the proper place of worship, the coming Messiah, and the fulfillment of Israel's expectations. Nothing about the conversation resembles an encounter with someone who is unfamiliar with Israel's God. On the contrary, she already inhabits Israel's religious world, even if from a Samaritan perspective. Jesus' offer of living water, therefore, fits naturally within the Old Testament. Promises concerning the restoration of Israel, promises that Isaiah himself associated with the outpouring of God's Spirit upon Israel and her descendants. The narrative never says that Jesus is abandoning Israel's covenant framework. Rather, it depicts the restoration reaching another community already connected to Israel's God and Israel's hopes. A similar observation can be made regarding the Canaanite woman in Matthew 15. For many Christians, This encounter marks the moment Jesus extended salvation to Gentiles. Yet the narrative itself begins with Jesus declaring, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." That statement establishes the interpretive framework for everything that follows. Matthew's description of the woman as a Canaanite is particularly striking because by the 1st century, Canaanite was no longer a normal ethnic designation. Mark's parallel account calls her a Syro-Phoenician, the contemporary geographical term. Matthew instead chooses an intentionally archaic label that evokes Israel's ancient enemies and heightens the dramatic tension. The narrative itself never says she was a pagan outsider disconnected from Israel's covenant world, nor does it mention salvation. It records the healing of her daughter in response to remarkable faith. The assumption that this encounter inaugurated salvation for all Gentiles is something readers bring to the text rather than something Matthew explicitly states. The same pattern appears in Romans 8. Paul's olive tree is often interpreted as though Gentiles from every nation are grafted into an entirely new people of God. Yet the tree itself is unmistakably Israel's. Its root consists of the patriarchal promises. The natural branches belong to Israel. The cultivated tree represents the covenant people. The question, therefore, is not whether Gentiles are connected to the tree, but which Gentiles Paul has in mind. Within the historical setting of Acts, the answer is hardly surprising. Paul's ministry consistently encountered Gentiles who had already attached themselves to Israel's God through synagogue life. These covenantally connected Gentiles naturally fit Paul's imagery of wild branches being grafted into Israel's covenant tree. The metaphor does not require the creation of a universal religion. It illustrates God's faithfulness in preserving and restoring his covenant people. Ephesians chapter 2 is frequently cited as proof that all humanity has now entered God's covenant. Paul certainly speaks of Gentiles who were once strangers to the covenants of promise. Yet the context deserves careful attention. These Gentiles have now become fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. The language is political and covenantal rather than universal. They are incorporated into an already existing commonwealth. Furthermore, Paul identifies the dividing wall as consisting of the law of commandments contained in ordinances. Whether one sees an allusion to the temple soreg or simply to the covenantal ordinances themselves, the point remains the same. The barrier separating Jews from covenantally attached Gentiles has been removed through Christ. Nothing in the passage requires us to conclude that Paul is discussing pagan humanity in general. The historical reality of God-fearers and proselytes already provides a perfectly natural audience for Paul's argument. Even the Great Commission is often read without sufficient attention to its covenantal setting. Jesus commands his disciples to make disciples of all nations. Yet those same disciples had spent years hearing Jesus insist that his earthly mission was directed to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. After his resurrection, they immediately ask, "Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" Jesus does not rebuke the question as fundamentally misguided. Instead, he redirects their attention to the timing of that restoration and commissions them to bear witness beginning in Jerusalem, then Judea, then Samaria, and finally to the ends of the earth. That geographical progression mirrors the dispersion of Israel and the synagogue network already established throughout the Mediterranean world. Luke's narrative in Acts follows that pattern with remarkable consistency. One of the strongest pieces of evidence for this covenantal framework is the remarkable absence of sustained missions to pagan temples. Certainly, the apostles occasionally encountered pagans. Paul addresses idol worshippers in Lystra and later speaks before philosophers in Athens. Yet Luke never presents these episodes as the primary strategy of the apostolic mission. They are exceptions arising from Incidental circumstances. Paul's normal practice remains unchanged. He enters the synagogue first. There, he proclaims Israel's Messiah to people already gathered around Israel's scriptures. Even when opposition forces him elsewhere, the synagogue remains the launching point for nearly every missionary journey. Luke seems determined that his readers notice this pattern. Some readers may wonder why this discussion matters. After all, does it really make a difference whether the first-century Gentiles were covenantally attached to Israel or completely disconnected from her? I believe it makes a tremendous difference because it shapes how we understand the entire storyline of Scripture. The Bible is not simply a collection of timeless religious principles. It tells a covenant story. That story begins with Abraham, develops through Israel, culminates in Israel's Messiah, and reaches its climax in the fulfillment of God's promises to his covenant people. If we remove that covenant framework, we inevitably begin reading later theological assumptions back into the biblical text. Recognizing the existence of a covenant community, broader than biological Israel, also explains why the New Testament consistently encounters Gentiles who already know Israel's scriptures, already worship Israel's God, already anticipate Israel's Messiah, and already participate in synagogue life. Such people are not anomalies. They are precisely what we would expect if the Old Testament's provisions for covenantal foreigners continued into the Second Temple period. The apostles were not inventing a new category of people. They were proclaiming the fulfillment of God's promises among communities that had long been prepared through Israel's scriptures and worship. None of this is intended to deny that pagans occasionally heard the apostles or that some abandoned idolatry after encountering their message. Acts itself records such encounters. The question is not whether they happened. The question is whether Luke presents them as defining the purpose and scope of the apostolic mission. The overwhelming pattern suggests otherwise. The apostles' mission remained focused upon the proclamation of Israel's Messiah within Israel's covenant world. Incidental encounters with pagans do not redefine the mission itself, any more than Paul's appearance before Roman governors transforms the gospel into a message directed primarily toward the Roman government. This understanding also helps explain why the New Testament repeatedly describes Christ's work as the fulfillment of promises made centuries earlier. Paul writes that Christ became a servant to the circumcision to confirm the promises made to the fathers. The author of Hebrews identifies Jesus as the mediator of the new covenant promised through Jeremiah. Peter proclaims that the events of Pentecost fulfilled Joel's prophecy. James interprets the inclusion of believing Gentiles through Amos's prophecy concerning David's restored tent. Again and again, the apostles explain their ministry by appealing to Israel's own scriptures rather than announcing the creation of an entirely new covenant with humanity at large. Ultimately, the question is not whether God loved the nations, nor whether people from outside Israel ever came to worship the God of Abraham. The Old Testament answers those questions long before the New Testament begins. The real question is this: who made up the covenant community to whom the Messiah was sent? When the evidence is allowed to speak for itself, a consistent picture emerges. The covenant community included more than biological Israelites. It included faithful foreigners who had joined themselves to Israel's God through the covenantal provisions established in the law, developed through Israel's history, and fully visible within the synagogue communities of the first century. Once that historical reality is recognized, many of the New Testament's most debated passages begin to fit naturally within the covenant story rather than standing outside it. The purpose of this presentation has not been to ask readers to accept a conclusion simply because it differs from traditional interpretations. Instead, it has been an invitation to reconsider the evidence. The Torah established lawful means for foreigners to become part of Israel's covenant community. The historical record confirms that proselytes and God-fearers filled the synagogues of the first century. The book of Acts repeatedly presents those synagogue communities as the primary audience of the apostolic mission. Jesus consistently defined his own ministry in terms of Israel's restoration, and the apostles repeatedly explained their work as the fulfillment of promises made to the fathers. Taken together, these observations suggest that the gospel's intended audience was neither humanity indiscriminately nor biological Israel alone. It was Israel's covenant community as the scriptures themselves had long defined it. Whether one ultimately accepts that conclusion or not, it deserves to be evaluated on the basis of the biblical text and the historical evidence, rather than on assumptions inherited from later theological traditions. The more carefully we examine Israel's covenant world, the more clearly the New Testament begins to read as the culmination of that story, rather than the beginning of an entirely different one.